Welcome to Serenity Fire, the podcast where wellness meets grit. I'm your host, Krista Guagenti, founder of Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique. Join me as we dive into the intriguing world of biohacking, clean living, cutting-edge spa trends, and the hustle, grind, and grit of entrepreneurship. From my personal battles with weight management, infertility, and a 30-year journey to create and launch my dream business, to building a sanctuary for those who have been touched by cancer, I'm here to share real talk, inspire big dreams, and spark a passion for holistic living inside each and every one of you. So let's dive in. Welcome back to Serenity Fire. Today we're continuing our conversation on healing peptides. I'm so excited about the science and possibilities around these therapies, and if you've spent any time in this ever-evolving world of wellness, biohacking, sports medicine, or regenerative medicine, you've probably heard someone making claims about peptides that seem too good to be true. Things like BPC-157 healed my torn rotator cuff. It completely healed my chronic tendonitis. My knee pain disappeared. My gut problems resolved. My shoulder healed in half the time. At some point, though, we have to stop and ask if one molecule can really do all of that. Because if the answer is yes, this could represent one of the most exciting developments in regenerative medicine. But if the answer is no, then we're looking at yet another example of hope racing ahead of evidence. Today, we're going to separate these two possibilities, not with opinions, not with marketing, not with testimonials, but with science. Because if you've been listening to this series, you already know that biological possibility, animal research, human clinical trials, and real-world clinical experience are not the same thing. And today, we're going to use everything we learned in episode 3. We'll put BPC-157 and these other peptides through the Serenity Fire peptide checklist and my promise versus proof scale. And we'll see where the science actually stands today. So let's begin. But before we jump right into BPC-157, I'd like to quickly remind you of something we talked about in our last episode. This episode isn't designed to convince you to take or not take a particular peptide. My goal is to help you understand what we know, what we think we know, what we don't know, and perhaps most importantly, how to think critically about emerging therapies, because the science will continue evolving. New studies will be published, recommendations may change, and what I'm sharing with you today reflects where the evidence stands today. Now, let's investigate our first healing peptide, BPC-157. What exactly is BPC-157? BPC stands for Body Protection Compound. The number 157 refers to the specific sequence of amino acids that make up this synthetic peptide fragment. Many people describe BPC-157 as though it's something scientists discovered floating around inside the human body. But what's interesting is that this theory is not exactly accurate. This is an area where a lot of websites unintentionally oversimplify the story. But here's what actually happened. Researchers who were studying the stomach became interested in naturally occurring protective proteins found within gastric juices. Remember, your stomach has an incredibly difficult job. It produces hydrochloric acid, which is strong enough to break down food, but it also produces digestive enzymes that are capable of digesting proteins. And this environment is harsh enough that without protection, your stomach could literally begin digesting itself. Fortunately, though, your body has evolved remarkable protective systems. Scientists studying those protective systems identified a larger protein involved in helping maintain and protect the lining of the gastrointestinal tract. BPC-157, however, is not that entire naturally occurring protein. It's a synthetic peptide fragment, a small portion of that larger protein derived from research into those naturally occurring protective proteins. And that's an important thing to think about, because when people say BPC-157 is naturally occurring, that's only partially true. The research originated from naturally occurring gastric protective proteins, but the BPC-157 peptide being used in research and clinical practice today is a laboratory-produced peptide. In other words, it's inspired by nature, but manufactured by science. So why does any of that matter? Honestly, it doesn't necessarily make the peptide better or worse. And as we've discussed in prior episodes, especially around hormone replacement therapy, many of our most important medications are synthetic versions, modified versions, or laboratory-created versions of naturally occurring biological molecules. Insulin, thyroid hormone, many antibiotics, and even some cancer drugs. Scientists frequently look to nature for inspiration. then they isolate, modify, or reproduce molecules that appear biologically important, and that's exactly what happened here. So what does BPC-157 actually do? Or maybe a better question is, what do researchers think it might do? That's where the excitement begins, because early lab research suggests that BPC-157 might influence several biological processes involved in healing. Things like collagen remodeling, blood vessel formation, nitric oxide signaling, growth factor communication, immune signaling, and inflammatory regulation. If those pathways sound familiar, they should, because they're involved in healing throughout the body, not just inside the stomach. But wait, if this came from the stomach, why would it be able to help a shoulder or a tendon or a ligament or a muscle? At first glimpse, that almost sounds like snake oil, because historically, whenever someone claims a therapy fixes everything, our skepticism naturally immediately rises. That's healthy though, and that's also where the biology with this peptide becomes fascinating. Researchers don't believe BPC-157 is targeting the shoulder per se, or the knee, or the gut, or the Achilles tendon, or whatever it is that you're trying to heal. Instead, they believe it may influence several fundamental healing pathways that many different tissues happen to use. Think about it. Your tendons, ligaments, skin, muscles, blood vessels, intestinal lining, and even parts of your nervous system all depend on many of the same biological processes. They all rely on collagen remodeling, healthy blood vessel formation, communication between growth factors, balancing inflammatory signaling, nitric oxide pathways, immune cell coordination. Those aren't tendon pathways, they're healing pathways. That's a completely different way of thinking about the body. So instead of asking, can this peptide heal 10 different organs, researchers began asking, could this peptide influence biological pathways that many different organs share? And that's a much more scientifically reasonable question. It also explains why researchers became so interested in BPC-157. Now, I want to emphasize something very important. Notice what I've been saying. I've said researchers believe, scientists are investigating, animal studies suggest. I have not said human studies have conclusively proven. Those are completely different statements, and it's exactly why I created the promise versus proof scale, to help us separate biological plausibility from proven clinical benefit. One peptide affecting multiple tissues doesn't necessarily mean it's specifically targeting those exact tissues, but what it does mean is that it may be influencing a handful of healing pathways that many tissues happen to share. So what makes scientists so excited? Because researchers aren't necessarily looking at this molecule as something that directly heals tissues. Instead, they're asking a different question. Could it help the body coordinate healing more efficiently? Healing isn't controlled by a single cell or a single chemical. It requires blood vessels delivering oxygen and nutrients, immune cells managing inflammation, fibroblasts laying down collagen, stem cells responding to injury, growth factors sending signals, and dozens of molecular pathways working together in precisely the right sequence. If one part of that process is impaired, healing can slow dramatically. BPC-157 appears to interact with several of those pathways simultaneously, which is why researchers find it so incredibly intriguing. You can think of healing like an orchestra. You have the strings, the brass, the percussion, and the woodwinds. Every musician knows how to play, but if they're all playing at the wrong time, the result is chaos. Healing works much in the same way. Blood vessels, inflammatory cells, growth factors, collagen production, and immune cells all have specific jobs. Researchers are interested in whether BPC-157 helps those systems work together more effectively, not by replacing them, but by improving the coordination between them. So much like the orchestra, creating the symphony of music rather than a scatter of musicians just playing random notes. But does the evidence actually support that theory? And that's where I want to go next. So what does the research actually show? Does BPC-157 actually work? As you've probably guessed by now, the answer depends on which layer of evidence we're talking about. So let's walk through it exactly the way we built our framework in the last episode. We'll start with biology, then we'll look at the animal research, then human studies, real-world clinical experience, and finally, we'll put it all together using our promise versus proof scale. So starting with step 1, does the biology make sense? This is actually where BPC-157 really shines. Researchers have proposed several mechanisms that are biologically plausible. Again, the keyword here is plausible. Current research suggests that BPC-157 may influence processes such as angiogenesis, or the formation of new blood vessels, fibroblast activity, which plays a role in collagen production and tissue repair, nitric oxide signaling, which is important for blood flow and vascular function, inflammatory signaling pathways, growth factor communication, tendon to bone healing, protection of the gastrointestinal lining, and possibly nerve regeneration in certain experimental models. It's all so exciting, and when scientists look at all of those mechanisms together, it's easy to understand why interest in this peptide has exploded. Now let's move to the animal research. Sometimes people dismiss animal studies, but I don't. Animal studies are where we first learn whether a biological theory might actually translate into a living system. Without them, many of today's standard medical treatments would never have reached human clinical trials. But it's equally important to remember that mice aren't people. Neither are rats nor rabbits. Many therapies perform beautifully in animals, but ultimately fail in humans. Not because the animal studies were poor, but because human biology is far more complicated. Animal studies tell us what's possible. Human studies tell us what's probable. And with BPC-157, when looking across multiple animal studies, researchers have reported improvements in areas such as tendon healing, ligament healing, muscle injuries, bone healing, nerve recovery, gastrointestinal ulcers, inflammatory bowel disease models, blood vessel formation, even certain brain and spinal cord injury models. And when you look at that list, it almost seems too impressive, which is exactly why many scientists remain cautious. And whenever one therapy appears to help many different tissues, our skepticism should naturally increase. Not because the findings are necessarily wrong, but because extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary evidence. At the same time, there is biological explanation for why these results may not be as surprising as they first appear. Remember what we talked about earlier. Researchers aren't suggesting BPC-157 somehow knows where your shoulder is, or your knee, or your stomach, or whatever. They're proposing that it may influence fundamental healing pathways shared by many tissues throughout the body. If that's true, then seeing effects across multiple organs becomes much more biologically plausible. Again, plausible, not proven. Now, what about human studies? This is where the conversation changes a bit, and it's important that it does, because human evidence carries much more weight when we're deciding whether a therapy should become part of routine medical practice. So what do we actually have right now when it comes to BPC-157? The honest answer is not nearly as much as many people would assume. Despite all of the excitement around BPC-157, large, high-quality randomized human clinical trials are still lacking. There have been some early human studies, limited clinical investigations, and published reports, but the evidence base is relatively small compared with many other FDA-approved medications. And that's one of the primary reasons organizations like the FDA continue asking for more data. Not because they necessarily believe BPC-157 doesn't work, but because they don't yet have the kind of evidence typically expected before approving a new medication. But the absence of strong human evidence is not proof that a therapy is ineffective. It means uncertainty remains, and we do really need to respect that. So knowing this, why are so many physicians using BPC-157? This is definitely a fair question, and the truth is that sometimes physicians report seeing encouraging clinical results. Patients describe improvements in chronic tendon injuries, ligament injuries, joint pain, recovery after orthopedic procedures, certain gastrointestinal conditions, and soft tissue healing. Should we ignore these experiences just because the peptide isn't approved by the FDA? In my opinion, the answer is no, because clinical experience has always played an important role in medicine. Some of today's standard treatments were first noticed because observant physicians recognized patterns before formal studies even existed. And we see that a lot with things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, LED light bed therapy, and some of the other things that we do at Panacea. But clinical experience also has its own limitations. Without control groups, it's difficult to know how much improvement came from that particular peptide itself versus maybe something like physical therapy, time, placebo effects, better nutrition, reduced inflammation, or just natural healing that might have occurred anyway. And that's why medicine ultimately depends on well-designed clinical trials, not because physician experience doesn't matter, but because controlled studies help us separate correlation from causation. And when it comes to patient testimonials, those aren't enough either. which is another place where I think it's easy to get pulled into these things emotionally. You can find hundreds, maybe even thousands of people online who swear BPC-157 changed their lives. Some describe remarkable recoveries, others say it did nothing. A few report side effects. So what should we do with testimonials? I think we appreciate them and we consider them as part of this puzzle and this Serenity and Fire peptide checklist, but we don't confuse them with scientific proof. A testimonial tells us what happened to one person. A clinical trial, if done correctly, helps us understand what likely is to happen across many people. Both are valuable, but they answer different questions. A testimonial tells us what happened. Research helps us understand why it happened and whether we should expect it to happen again. So at this point, if I were to sum up BPC-157, I would say it remains one of the most biologically intriguing regenerative peptides being studied, but the human evidence still has some catching up to do. That's neither an endorsement or a dismissal. It's simply where I believe the evidence stands today, and in just a few minutes, I'm going to put it through the promise versus proof scale. Now let's transition to TB-500. If you spent any time researching BPC-157, you've probably noticed that almost every article, every podcast, every longevity clinic, and every regenerative medicine practice mentions another peptide right alongside it, and that's TB-500. They're discussed together so often that many people assume they're basically the same therapy, but they're not. They're actually different molecules, and they're believed to influence healing differently. And understanding those differences helps us understand why researchers and many clinicians have become interested in using them together. So let's take a closer look. What exactly is TB-500? Let's start with the name. While BPC-157 is a synthetic peptide derived from a protective protein found in the stomach, TB-500 comes from a completely different family. It is also synthetic, but it's modeled after a naturally occurring protein called thymosin beta-4. Thymosin beta-4 has actually been known to science for decades. It's found throughout many tissues in the body, and researchers first became interested in it because it appeared to play an important role in the body's normal response to injury. Unlike BPC-157, which, as we discussed earlier, originated from research into protective proteins associated with the stomach, thymosin beta-4 is much more widely distributed throughout the body. Scientists have identified it in tissues ranging from the skin and muscles to the heart, blood vessels, eyes, and immune cells. That immediately raised an interesting question. If this naturally occurring protein is present throughout the body, could it be involved in coordinating healing wherever injury occurs? And that's the question researchers have been trying to answer. But before we dive into what thymosin specifically does in the body, I want to point out one quick caveat about TB-500 and thymosin beta-4, and that is that many people get confused thinking these are the same thing. That's not the case. They are not the same thing. Thymosin beta-4 is a naturally occurring protein found throughout the body, and just like BPC-157, TB-500 is not simply a bottle of naturally occurring human protein. It's a laboratory-created peptide based on a protein of the much larger thymosin beta-4 molecule. Scientists often do this when doing research and creating therapies. Rather than studying an enormous protein, they identify the portion of that larger protein that they believe carries much of the biological activity, and then they create a smaller synthetic version that's easier to manufacture, study, and potentially use therapeutically. Nature provides the blueprint, science develops the version being investigated. And that's exactly what happened with BPC-157, and it's the same general concept here with TB-500. Okay, so what exactly is thymosin beta-4 believed to do for the body? Current research suggests thymosin beta-4, and by extension TB-500, may influence several important biological processes involved in healing, including cell migration, which helps move repaired cells to injured cells, angiogenesis, or the formation of new blood vessels, tissue remodeling, inflammatory signaling, cellular communication, and organization of the extracellular matrix, the structural framework that actually supports our tissues. These are many of the same fundamental healing pathways we talked about earlier with BPC-157. Notice that neither peptide appears to target a single organ. And again, researchers believe both may influence biological systems that many organs have in common. So again, we're not saying this peptide heals shoulders or this peptide heals knees. Instead, the theory is that these peptides may help optimize some of the underlying biological processes improved in healing itself. So if we put all of this into plain English, imagine your city has just been hit by a major storm or even a tornado. Roads are blocked, power lines are down, emergency crews are trying to reach damaged neighborhoods, construction teams are waiting for supplies. Nothing can really move forward until someone coordinates the response. Researchers believe thymosin beta-4 may function a little like one of those coordinators, not because it's physically rebuilding damaged tissue itself, but because it may help organize many of the cellular events that need to occur before healing can happen efficiently. If that's true, it's easy to understand why scientists became so interested in studying it. So the next thing you might be asking is, why are we seeing BPC-157 and TB-500 frequently being used together on the same patient? The answer is because many clinicians believe they have overlapping but complementary effects, even though we don't yet have high-quality clinical trials proving that combining them is superior to using either one alone. And the reason they do that is because while they're both theoretically impacting the healing process, they don't appear to target exactly the same biology. So think of it this way. BPC-157 seems to have more evidence, primarily from animal and preclinical studies, around tendons and ligaments, gastrointestinal healing, blood vessel formation, nitric oxide signaling, local tissue repair, and modulating inflammation. TB-500, on the other hand, appears to have broader effects related to cell migration, or helping repair cells move to injured areas, actin regulation, which is important for cell movement and wound closure, tissue remodeling, angiogenesis, reducing fibrosis and scarring, muscle recovery, and potentially broader systemic healing. So there is overlap, but they're not identical. And if we go back to that storm analogy, BPC-157 is like improving the local construction crew. They get more supplies, the roads are cleared, communication improves, the workers become more efficient. And TB-500 is more like bringing in additional skilled workers from neighboring towns and helping them get the job done more quickly. One peptide may help local repair process work better. The other peptide may help recruit and mobilize more of the body's repair machinery. Again, it's an analogy, not a proven mechanism, but it's how many clinicians conceptualize the difference. So many regenerative medicine physicians choose to prescribe BPC-157 and TB-500 as part of the same treatment protocol. Notice what I said, the same treatment protocol, not necessarily mixed together in the same syringe, so not necessarily compounded into the same vial. Whether two peptides can actually or should be physically combined depends on their stability, compatibility, sterility, and the practices of the compounding pharmacy preparing them. So when we talk about stacking these peptides, they're usually referring to using them together during the same course of treatment. And since researchers believe these peptides may influence different but complementary aspects of the healing process, many practitioners choose to stack them when prescribing. And if those theories ultimately prove to be correct, it's understandable why some clinicians believe they may complement one another. But this is where we need to pause a bit and look at biological theory versus scientific proof. Everything I just described is based on biological rationale, laboratory science, animal research, and clinical observations. What we do not yet have today are large, high-quality human clinical trials demonstrating that combining BPC-157 and TB-500 produce better outcomes than using either peptide alone. That doesn't mean the therapy combination doesn't work. It simply means we just don't know yet. Many physicians report encouraging clinical observations. Many patients describe positive outcomes. There is certainly a biologically plausible reason why the combination might make sense. But biological plausibility and scientifically proven, as I've mentioned before, are not the same thing. And if you listen to this series from the beginning, you already know that's a distinction I'm going to continue to make over and over again, because I think it's one of the most important concepts in all of regenerative medicine. And plainly speaking, imagine someone tells you chocolate cake tastes amazing with chocolate icing. Great. Most of us would probably agree. But if you wanted to scientifically determine whether the icing actually made the cake better, you'd have to compare chocolate cake without icing, chocolate cake with icing, maybe even different kinds of icing. Otherwise, you really don't know which ingredient deserves the credit. That's exactly what controlled clinical trials are designed to do. They're not trying to ruin the excitement. They're just trying to identify what actually deserves the praise. The same thing is true when you do something like an elimination diet. So for example, when you're doing an elimination diet, you have to cut out things like caffeine, sugar, alcohol, gluten, dairy, soy, corn, eggs, nuts. And then you have to do that for an extended period of time. And then when you want to reintroduce them back into the body, you have to do one food at a time. And you do it for a certain period of time. And then you discontinue it again before you ever introduce the other or the next food. So let's say that you start your elimination diet with eggs. You add them back in, you have a little bit of a reaction to them. It's not a super big one, so you don't think it's a big deal, and you just continue eating them. And then you add in gluten, and then you have a big reaction. Well, now you don't know, is it the combination of the gluten and the eggs? Is it really the eggs? Because now you've had them for a longer period of time and now your body's starting to react to them, or was it really just the gluten? So you have to do that process of elimination and be able to really understand what's causing what reaction. And that's really what clinical trials do for us. So where does the evidence with TB-500 stand today? Honestly, in a position that's remarkably similar to BPC-157. The biological foundation is strong. The animal studies are encouraging. Many clinicians remain enthusiastic, but the human evidence still has some catching up to do. And that's okay. It's not failure. It's simply where the science currently stands. And remember, good science doesn't ask us to stop being excited. It's simply asking us to match our excitement to the strength of the evidence. So far, we've looked at 2 peptides that are primarily associated with tissue repair and recovery, but healing isn't always about rebuilding tissues. Sometimes it's about calming the inflammation that's preventing healing from happening in the first place. And that's exactly where our next peptide enters the story. KPV. It's only 3 amino acids long, but it may end up teaching us one of the biggest lessons in peptide science, that sometimes the smallest molecules can ask the biggest biological questions. So what is KPV? Unlike BPC, KPV is not an acronym. It's simply named after the 3 amino acids that make up the peptide. K for lysine, P for proline, V for valine. That makes KPV what's known as a tripeptide, a peptide made from only 3 amino acids. And that's one of the things that makes it so fascinating, because despite it being so incredibly small, researchers believe it may have surprisingly important biological effects. So where did it come from? Unlike BPC-157, which originated from research involving protective organs in the stomach, or TB-500, which was developed from thymosin beta-4, KPV comes from something completely different. It's derived from a naturally occurring hormone called alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, or alpha MSH. Now, don't let the name intimidate you. Despite the word melanocyte being in its name, scientists eventually realized that alpha MSH does much more than influence skin pigmentation. It can also play important roles in regulating inflammation and helping coordinate aspects of the immune system. And researchers later discovered something else too. They discovered that this tiny 3 amino acid fragment, KPV, appeared to retain many of alpha MSH's anti-inflammatory properties while avoiding many of its hormonal effects, which immediately caught scientists' attention. Because if a tiny fragment could produce many of the same desired biological effects without the side effects, it might eventually become a useful therapeutic molecule all by itself. So when we put this into plain English, think of it like this. Imagine your favorite movie. Now, imagine taking one short scene from that movie. You probably wouldn't expect that one scene could capture the emotion, the message, or the impact of the entire film. But occasionally, one scene does exactly that. Researchers believe KPV may work in a similar way. Instead of using the entire alpha MSH molecule, they're studying a tiny fragment that appears to preserve much of the biological activity they care most about. It's honestly all so remarkable, isn't it? Okay. So since this episode is all about healing peptides, you might be asking, is KPV really actually a healing peptide? Personally, I don't think of KPV as a classic healing peptide. I think of it more as an immune regulating peptide. But sometimes healing isn't simply about rebuilding damaged tissues. And sometimes the biggest obstacle to healing isn't a lack of repair. It's too much inflammation. We often think of inflammation as something really bad, but that's not really true, at least not all of the time, because inflammation is one of the body's normal responses to injury. Without inflammation, healing wouldn't even begin. The problem occurs when inflammation becomes excessive, lasts too long, or never completely turns itself off. That's why inflammation can begin interfering with the very healing process it was originally trying to support. And it's also why I'm always saying that inflammation is the root to all evil. Researchers believe KPV may help regulate some of those inflammatory signaling pathways, not by shutting the immune system down, but by helping it respond more appropriately, which is super cool. Now let's put that one into plain English. Imagine you're on a construction site. If no workers ever show up, nothing gets built. But if 10,000 workers all arrive at once, everyone gets in each other's way. No one can move, no one can communicate, and surprisingly, little gets accomplished. Inflammation works a little like that. Too little and healing struggles to begin. Too much and healing struggles to finish. Researchers believe KPV helps create a healthier balance, but again, we're still learning. And here's what the research is showing. Much like BPC-157 and TB-500, the lab research surrounding KPV is genuinely interesting. Animal and lab studies have reported really encouraging findings involving intestinal inflammation, gut barrier function, inflammatory bowel disease, skin inflammation, certain immune-mediated conditions, and inflammatory signaling. Researchers have also become interested in KPV because chronic inflammation appears to play a role in so many different diseases. That doesn't mean KPV treats all of these diseases, but it explains why scientists continue investigating it across multiple areas of medicine. And when we look at human studies, here's where the story becomes really familiar with this whole journey of peptides. Because while the biological foundation is strong, the laboratory research is encouraging, and the animal studies are promising, high-quality human clinical evidence, as we've said with the other peptides, still remains relatively limited, which is becoming one of the recurring themes throughout this entire series. Excellent biology, encouraging preclinical science, and growing physician interest, but human evidence is still catching up. Again, it's not a criticism, it's simply an honest assessment of where the science stands today. So could KPV become more important than we think? I think so because, as I mentioned, inflammation isn't just involved in one disease. It's involved in hundreds. Cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, inflammatory bowel disease, neurodegenerative diseases, arthritis, skin disorders, metabolic disease, and even aging itself. So if researchers eventually identify safe ways to better regulate inflammation, the potential implications could extend far beyond any single condition. That's why KPV has attracted so much scientific curiosity and attention. Not because we know it changes all of the outcomes, but because the biology suggests it's asking some very important and intriguing questions. So let's look at the bigger picture. These peptides are all trying to accomplish something slightly different. BPC-157 appears to be most closely associated with tissue protection and repair. TB-500 appears to be more involved in coordinating some of the cellular events that occur after injury. KPV appears to be focused more on regulating inflammation and supporting a healthier immune response. Different biology, different hypotheses, different potential applications, but all very exciting and promising when it comes to healing the body. So after spending the last hour exploring these very fascinating molecules, where do I actually stand? How confident should we be? Which one of these has the strongest evidence? Which one has the biggest unanswered questions? And how do we separate genuine scientific promise from marketing hype? I think it's time to bring everything together. So let's see where each of these peptides land on the promise versus proof scale. At the end of the day, I think the biggest takeaway isn't really about any one particular peptide. It's about the field of regenerative medicine itself. These peptides represent something much bigger than 3 individual therapies. They represent a different way of thinking about medicine altogether. Historically, much of medicine has focused on replacing something. Replace the hormone, replace the joint, replace the heart valve, replace the damaged tissue. Peptide science asks different questions. Instead of asking, what can we replace? It asks, can we help the body repair itself more efficiently? And that's a fascinating shift in thinking. And honestly, it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in this field. But being interested and being convinced aren't the same thing. I think the biology behind these peptides is incredibly and genuinely exciting. I think the laboratory science is fascinating. I think the animal research gives us good reasons to continue asking lots of questions. I also understand why many experienced clinicians are enthusiastic about what they're seeing in their practices. But I also think it's important to recognize that the excitement has moved ahead of the human evidence. That doesn't mean these peptides don't work, and it doesn't mean that they do work. It also doesn't mean that I think you should take them or you shouldn't take them. It means we're still learning. And I think we should be comfortable saying that because uncertainty isn't weakness, it's honesty. In fact, I think many people in modern healthcare feel pressured to speak without absolute certainty. But the reality is that science rarely works that way. Good scientists remain curious, good physicians continue learning, and good patients ask thoughtful questions. That's exactly what I hope this series encourages you to do. Not become cynical, not become naive, but become scientifically curious, to appreciate exciting discoveries while remaining humble enough to acknowledge what we still don't know. To me, that's where innovation and integrity meet, and that's exactly where I try to stand. The goal isn't to become skeptical of everything. The goal is to become thoughtful about everything. So now let's put the promise versus proof scale to work. Again, this isn't a recommendation by me. It's not a product rating, and it's definitely not medical advice. It's simply my clinical assessment of where the evidence stands today. And as new research is published and as the science evolves, these scores may or may not change. But here's where I stand on peptides today as we sit. BPC-157, when we look at biological foundation, I would rank it a 9 out of 10 because the proposed mechanisms are biologically compelling and supported by a strong understanding of tissue repair. When we look at preclinical evidence with BPC-157, I also give that a 9 out of 10 because the lab and animal research are remarkably consistent across multiple injury models. When it comes to human clinical evidence, though, I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. The data is encouraging, but it still lacks the large, high-quality randomized clinical trials needed before drawing stronger conclusions. When it comes to clinical observations, I'm giving BPC-157 a 7 out of 10. Many experienced clinicians report meaningful improvements in musculoskeletal injuries and gastrointestinal conditions. Those observations definitely deserve attention, but they're not a substitute for controlled clinical trials, which is why I only gave it a 7. And when we look at long-term safety evidence, I'm giving this peptide a 2 out of 10. This remains one of the biggest unanswered questions with this peptide. We simply just don't have enough long-term human data yet. So when it comes to my overall confidence in BPC-157, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 rating because it's one of the most biologically intriguing regenerative peptides currently being investigated. It's also promising enough to justify continued research, but it's not yet supported by the level of human evidence that I'd personally like to see before routine, widespread clinical use is conducted. When it comes to TB-500, I'm giving it an 8.5 out of 10 because it has a very strong biological rationale. When it comes to preclinical evidence, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 because it is demonstrating consistently encouraging laboratory and animal research. But when it comes to human clinical evidence, I'm giving it a 2.5 out of 10 because the data here is still relatively limited. When it comes to clinical observations, I'm giving it a 6.5 out of 10 because while many clinicians believe it complements BPC-157, robust comparative human studies simply aren't available yet. And with the safety evidence, I'm giving it a 2 out of 10. There's just so many important questions that remain regarding the long-term safety of this peptide. So my overall confidence in TB-500 is going to be a 5.5 out of 10. It's a fascinating peptide that absolutely deserves continued investigation. So now when we look at KPV, when it comes to the biological foundation, I'm rating this peptide as an 8 out of 10, especially because it's compelling from an immune regulation and inflammation perspective. When we look at the preclinical evidence, it's also getting an 8 out of 10. There's strong laboratory and animal findings involving inflammatory pathways, so I feel that that rating is really justified. When we look at human clinical evidence, though, this one's also getting a 3 out of 10. The data is still definitely developing. And when we look at clinical observations with KPV, this one gets a 5.5 out of 10. There are interesting early observations, particularly involving inflammatory conditions, and that's why I gave it that rating. And when it comes to long-term safety evidence, this one's getting a 3 out of 10. It's more reassuring than some other areas of peptide research, but still limited safety data overall. So my overall confidence with KPV is going to be a 5.5 out of 10. This peptide is one of the more intriguing emerging immune regulating peptides, which is why I'm particularly watching this one and I'm super excited about it, but we're still in the early chapters of its story. So overall, the most exciting therapies aren't the ones surrounded by the loudest marketing. They're the ones that continue earning our confidence as better evidence emerges. So today we explored 3 of the most talked about peptides in regenerative medicine. We looked at where they came from, how scientists believe they work, what the lab research is showing, where the human evidence stands today, and why there's so much excitement and healthy debate surrounding them. I hope today's conversation also demonstrated something even bigger. Science isn't just about collecting information, it's about learning how to evaluate information. And that's exactly what we're trying to do throughout this series. In our next episode, we're shifting from healing peptides to growth hormone stimulating peptides and body composition therapies. We'll explore things like CJC-1295, ipamorelin, sermorelin, tesamorelin, MK-677, also known as ibutamorin, and we'll also answer questions like, can these therapies really stimulate growth hormone naturally? How do they compare with growth hormone injections? Can they improve muscle mass, body composition, sleep, or recovery? What are the known risks? What remains uncertain? And perhaps my favorite question, why is one of the most popular peptides in this category not actually a peptide at all? We'll answer that next time. And just as we did today, we'll evaluate every therapy using the Serenity Fire peptide checklist and the promise versus proof scale, because every emerging therapy deserves the same thoughtful evaluation. And every patient deserves clear, balanced information grounded in the best available evidence. As we close out today's episode, please remember that everything shared on Serenity Fire is meant for general education and inspiration purposes only. The topics we discuss are not intended to diagnose, treat, or replace personalized medical care, so please always consult with your healthcare provider regarding your individual health concerns, laboratory results, medications, and treatment decisions before trying anything we talk about on the show. Your health is unique, and your care should be too. Okay, that's it for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for listening to Serenity Fire. If today's episode helped you look beyond the headlines, think more critically about emerging therapies, and better understand where today's science truly stands, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave a review, and share this episode with those you love most. Together, we can empower more people to make informed, evidence-based decisions about their health. Until next time, stay curious, question boldly, let the evidence lead the way, and keep balancing serenity with fire. I'm Krista Guigeni, and I'll talk with you more in our next episode. At Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique, we don't just offer traditional spa treatments. We create rituals that relax your mind, restore your health, and rejuvenate your spirit. From biohacking technologies to advanced oncology-trained care, everything we do is designed to help you heal on the deepest level with clean, holistic therapies, products, and amenities that are second to none. And right now, you can experience two of my favorites, our whole body LED light bed or hyperbaric oxygen therapies. And as a thank you for listening, you'll get 10% off your first session when you use the code Serenity10 at booking. What is your panacea? Let us help you find it, because true wellness isn't a quick fix, it's a ritual.